Imagine walking into a courtroom expecting a routine trial, and then a teenager, barely old enough to drive, steps up to represent the defendant. The entire room bursts into laughter. The judge mocks him, the lawyers whisper, and everyone is convinced it's a joke. But within minutes, that same teenager flips the courtroom on its head, silences the prosecution, and stuns the judge into respect. This isn't fiction. It's the unbelievable story of a genius prodigy who made history. The entrance that changed everything. Imagine this. A crowded courtroom buzzing with whispers, the air thick with tension. The judge sits high on his bench, adjusting his glasses, ready to deliver justice. Lawyers shuffle papers. The defendant nervously wipes his sweaty palms, and the audience murmurs quietly as they wait for the case to begin. Suddenly, the heavy wooden doors swing open, and in walks a teenager. Yes, a boy who looked no older than 16. Messy hair, sneakers, and a backpack hanging loosely off one shoulder. The entire courtroom erupted in chuckles. One attorney whispered with a grin, "What's this? Bring your kid to work day." Even the judge smirked, amused at what he thought was a joke. But the boy didn't laugh. He walked confidently up to the front, stood tall, and when the bailiff asked who he was, the boy replied calmly and firmly, "I'm here to represent the defendant." The room froze. The laughter died instantly. The silence was so heavy you could hear someone's pen drop. The judge's mockery. The judge leaned forward, raising an eyebrow. "You? Represent someone? Son, this is a courtroom, not a high school project." The audience chuckled again, but the boy stood steady. His voice was clear. "With respect, Your Honor, I am licensed to practice law, and I am here to defend my client." Gasps filled the room. The defendant, a middle-aged man accused of fraud, looked as if he had just seen a ghost. The prosecutor folded her arms, shaking her head with a smirk, convinced this was in way over his head. The judge, amused but skeptical, waved his hand. "Let me see some proof before we waste this court's time." Without hesitation, the boy unzipped his backpack and pulled out a sleek leather folder. Inside was his official bar certification, sealed and signed. The bailiff carried it up to the bench. The judge adjusted his glasses, scanned the paper carefully, and his smirk slowly disappeared. This wasn't a prank. This boy was the real deal, the prodigy revealed. His name was Ethan Parker, and while he looked like an ordinary teenager, he was actually a legal prodigy. Ethan had graduated high school at 12, finished college by 14, and passed law school at 15. By 16, he had scored one of the highest marks on the state bar exam. This was his very first major trial, and he had chosen it deliberately. While others might have avoided the spotlight, Ethan wanted to prove something, that brilliance had no age limit. But the judge wasn't impressed just yet. "Fine," he sighed. "You want to play lawyer? Let's see how you handle yourself." The courtroom battle begins. The prosecutor was first to speak. She laid out her case with confidence, presenting documents, financial records, and witnesses that seemed to prove guilt beyond question. The jury nodded along. Many thought the trial was already over. Then it was Ethan's turn. He rose slowly, adjusted his tie, and approached the jury box with calm determination. His voice was steady, not too loud, not too soft. With precision, he began to point out flaws in the prosecution's evidence. The timeline didn't match. The witnesses contradicted themselves. And the financial documents? Ethan showed that they had been misinterpreted and didn't actually point to fraud at all. People began leaning forward, whispering in surprise. The boy wasn't just competent, he was brilliant. At one point, the prosecutor tried to trip him up by throwing complicated legal jargon his way. Ethan didn't flinch. Instead, he quoted obscure case law that even the judge had to pause and think about. Slowly, the laughter and doubt that had filled the courtroom earlier disappeared. All eyes were on the boy genius. The turning point, the defendant, who had been pale and nervous at the start, now watched with growing hope. Each time Ethan dismantled a piece of the prosecution's case, the man's confidence returned. The jury, who once looked certain of guilt, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The judge, who had mocked Ethan at the start, now studied him carefully, his expression unreadable. Finally, Ethan delivered his closing argument. He walked to the center of the courtroom, stood tall despite his small frame, and said, "Justice isn't about appearances. It isn't about age or reputation. Justice is about truth. And the truth here is clear. My client is innocent." The room was silent. The verdict and respect earned. Hours later, the jury filed back in. The foreman stood, cleared his throat, and delivered the words that shook the courtroom. "Not guilty." The defendant broke down in tears, hugging Ethan tightly. The gallery erupted in whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously, already preparing headlines. The judge called Ethan forward. His tone was no longer mocking. It was respectful. "Young man, when you first walked into this courtroom, I thought you were a distraction. But today, you've reminded us that justice can come in unexpected forms. You have my respect." Ethan simply nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor. I only did my duty." With that, he picked up his backpack and walked out. No longer the teenager people had laughed at. He was the prodigy lawyer who had just made history. The laughter that started it all. The judge couldn't help himself. He burst out laughing. His booming voice echoed through the courtroom. "You? Representing someone? Son, this isn't a high school debate club. This is a courtroom." The audience chuckled along with him. To everyone watching, the boy standing there looked, who had sat slumped in fear at the start, now looked at Ethan with hope in his eyes. The jury, once so certain, now leaned in, listening intently. And the judge, who had laughed the loudest, now sat silently, his chin resting on his hand, studying every move this young attorney made. By the time Ethan delivered his closing argument, there was no laughter left, only silence. "Justice," he said firmly, looking at the jury, "is not about age, appearance, or assumptions. Justice is about truth. And the truth is, my client is innocent. Respect earned." When the verdict came, not guilty, the courtroom erupted in shock. The defendant broke down in tears, hugging Ethan tightly. The prosecutor stood frozen, her earlier smirk gone entirely. The judge called Ethan forward. His tone had shifted completely. No more mockery, no more laughter, only respect. "Young man," the judge said, "when you walked in here today, I thought you were a distraction. But you've reminded us all that skill and justice can come in the most unexpected forms. You have my respect." Ethan simply nodded, slipped his bar certification back into his backpack, and walked out of the courtroom. No longer the boy who was laughed at, but the prodigy who had just rewritten history. The prodigy revealed the teenager was no ordinary kid. His name was Ethan Parker, and while he looked like a high schooler who should have been worrying about homework and video games, he was anything but ordinary. Ethan was a child prodigy, a once-in-a-generation mind. He had graduated high school before most kids even hit puberty, earned a college degree at just 14, and passed law school by the age of 15. By 16, he had taken the bar exam and not only passed. It was said he achieved one of the highest scores in the entire state's history. Yes, while he looked out of place in his sneakers and youthful face, Ethan was every bit a professional. And he had chosen this case for a reason. This was his very first major defense trial, and he wanted to prove himself, not by picking an easy win, but by facing one of the most difficult cases available. Still, none of that mattered to the judge. To him, Ethan looked like a kid playing dress-up. The judge leaned back, sighing. "Fine. You want to embarrass yourself? Go ahead. The prosecution may begin." The prosecution strikes. The prosecutor, a sharp and seasoned attorney, stepped forward confidently. She had been in dozens of trials, and this one looked like it was going to be an easy win. Her case seemed airtight. She laid out charts, documents, and witness statements in a neat, logical order. According to her, the defendant, a middle-aged man accused of fraud, had moved money around in suspicious ways, hidden transactions, and misled investors. Her voice was strong and polished. The jury nodded as she spoke, clearly following her narrative. For many watching, it seemed obvious. The defendant was guilty, and this boy lawyer had no chance of saving him. The prosecutor smirked slightly as she returned to her seat. To her, this was already over. Ethan takes the floor. Then it was Ethan's turn. He stood slowly, smoothing his tie, and walked toward the jury. His movements were deliberate, steady, and full of quiet confidence. There was no nervous shuffling, no stammer in his voice when he began. Instead, his tone was calm, precise, and surprisingly commanding for someone so young. The moment he spoke, the room fell silent. Ethan didn't waste time with long introductions. He went straight to the heart of the matter. Piece by piece, he began dismantling the prosecution's case. He pointed out how the timeline of alleged fraud didn't make sense. Transactions that were supposedly suspicious actually occurred months after the defendant no longer had control over the account. He highlighted flaws in the documents presented, showing that one had even been misfiled and wasn't linked to his client at all. Then, he turned to the witnesses. One by one, he replayed their testimony in front of the jury, calmly exposing contradictions. A key witness who had sworn the defendant was in a meeting on a certain date had already admitted earlier that they hadn't been present at that meeting themselves. Every word Ethan spoke was sharp, logical, and undeniable. The shift in the room. At first, the jury had leaned back in their seats, arms crossed, expecting little from the boyish lawyer. But as Ethan spoke, they leaned forward, elbows on their knees, hanging onto his words. Their eyes widened with every inconsistency he revealed. The prosecutor, once smug, now scribbled notes furiously, her expression tight with frustration. She hadn't expected to be challenged this way. Certainly not by someone who looked like he should be in 10th grade. The judge, who had mocked Ethan just minutes earlier, now sat silently. His smirk was gone. His eyes followed the young attorney carefully, his expression shifting from disbelief to something else, respect. The gallery, too, was transfixed. Whispers spread like wildfire among those watching. Who is this kid? How does he know so much? By the time Ethan finished his cross-examinations, the atmosphere of the courtroom had completely changed. The closing blow. Finally, it was time for closing arguments. Ethan walked to the center of the courtroom, pausing to look at each juror directly in the eye. Despite his youth, he didn't look intimidated. In fact, he looked like he belonged there more than anyone else. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, his voice clear. This case isn't about age, appearances, or assumptions. It's about truth. And the truth is this. The evidence doesn't hold up. The witnesses contradicted themselves. The timeline doesn't make sense. And the documents, when looked at carefully, don't point to fraud at all. He gestured calmly toward his client. My client isn't guilty of the crimes he's been accused of. He's guilty only of being misunderstood. And I ask you, not to be swayed by appearances, but by facts. Justice depends on it. The room was so quiet you could hear the ticking of clock, from laughter to silence. By the time Ethan was done, the courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. They were stunned. The same judge who had laughed at him earlier now sat with his hand covering his mouth, clearly rethinking his earlier words. The prosecutor sat stiffly, her confidence shattered. And the jury, the same people who had once been convinced of guilt, now looked uncertain, their expressions reflecting deep thought. Ethan Parker, the teenager everyone doubted, had turned the entire trial upside down. And for the first time since the trial began, the defendant allowed himself a faint smile. Respect growing in the room. The judge, who had mocked Ethan at first, now watched him with growing respect. He leaned back in his chair, his once amused smirk completely gone. Under his breath, barely audible to anyone nearby, he muttered, "Where did this kid come from?" Minutes ago, the judge had thought this trial would be a waste of time. To him, Ethan had looked like nothing more than a bold teenager trying to play dress-up. But now, as the boy dismantled the prosecution's arguments with the sharpness of a seasoned lawyer, the judge realized he was witnessing something rare, the prosecutor's frustration. The prosecutor, a veteran in her 40s with years of courtroom experience, had started the trial confident and composed. But with every passing minute, her confidence was crumbling. She grew frustrated. Her once polished arguments were unraveling in front of the jury. She decided to try a new tactic, intimidation. Rising from her seat, she unleashed a flurry of complex legal jargon. Her words came fast, sharp, and technical, designed not just to argue, but to overwhelm. She hoped Ethan would stumble, that his youth and inexperience would finally betray him. But Ethan didn't stumble. The room grew still. Ethan's voice, though calm, carried a weight that demanded attention. Justice is not about age, appearance, or titles. It's about truth. The words cut through the silence like a blade. The jury sat frozen. He paused for a moment, letting the gravity of his words sink in, before continuing. From the start, this case has been painted as open and shut. But when we looked closer, the evidence didn't match the accusations. The timeline doesn't add up. The documents were misinterpreted. The witnesses contradicted themselves. Nothing proves my client's guilt. He turned slightly, gesturing toward his client. My client is not guilty. He's not a criminal. He's an innocent man who was caught in a storm of assumptions and false conclusions. And I ask you, don't let assumptions decide his fate. Let the truth guide you. A courtroom frozen in silence. When Ethan finished, the room went completely silent. No one coughed. No one shuffled papers. The gallery of onlookers, the court officers, even the judge, all sat motionless, processing the words of the boy they had mocked only hours before. The silence was so deep, you could almost hear the heartbeat of every person present. The prosecutor's jaw was tight, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. The jury exchanged glances with one another, their expressions serious, contemplative. The defendant wiped his eyes, overwhelmed by the young lawyer's courage and brilliance. For a long, heavy moment, the courtroom remained frozen. And then, slowly, the judge nodded, his eyes still fixed on Ethan. What had started as laughter and mockery had transformed into awe and respect. The verdict yet to come. The jury had not spoken yet, but the atmosphere made one thing clear. Ethan Parker had changed the course of this trial. He had turned skepticism into belief, weakness into strength, and ridicule into silence. One by one, people rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. A standing ovation. Reporters rushed forward, cameras flashing, eager to capture the moment. Lawyers whispered among themselves, stunned that a teenager had just outperformed seasoned professionals. Even the bailiff, usually stoic and expressionless, gave Ethan a small nod of approval as he walked past. Headlines and history. By the end of the day, Ethan's name was everywhere. Headlines screamed across newspapers and online platforms. Teen prodigy lawyer stuns judge in courtroom victory. 16-year-old attorney defends man. Wins case against all odds. The boy who outshined the court. Social media exploded with clips and quotes from the trial. People debated, praised, and marveled at how someone so young could master a profession that takes others decades to perfect. But Ethan didn't care about the noise. For him, the trial was never about recognition. It was about truth, justice, and proving to himself that he belonged in that courtroom. The day he made history. As Ethan walked out of the courthouse, backpack slung over his shoulder, the sun was setting on the horizon. The glow reflected off the courthouse steps, almost as if the moment itself was marking history. That day, Ethan didn't just win a case. He shattered expectations. He silenced doubters. He proved that courage, brilliance, and truth know no age limit. And in doing so, he made history. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more unbelievable courtroom dramas and real-life twists you won't want to miss. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story. Sparkles.